It was the last week of the semester, and everyone in my class was stressed out. Senior year had been brutal, and the pressure was getting to everyone, especially as finals approached. Our most difficult exam was set for Friday morning, Advanced Psychology, with Dr. Lanson. He was known around campus as a strict, almost ruthless professor, and his exams were legendary for their difficulty. The kind of test that if you survived it, you'd tell stories about it for years. A few days before the exam, rumors started circulating about a study room hidden somewhere in the old humanities building, a place where Dr. Lanson kept his notes, test files, and copies of past exams. It was supposedly a kind of archive where decades of psychology materials were stored. The building itself was ancient, the kind of place with drafty hallways, creaking doors, and portraits of long-dead faculty members lining the walls. Most students avoided it after dark. My friend Mark heard the rumors first, passing them on to a small group of us who were all struggling to keep up with Dr. Lanson's class. "Look," he said, lowering his voice, "if we can find that room, we might have a shot at passing this thing. We'll know what kind of questions he likes to ask." It sounded risky, but the idea of going into the exam blind felt even worse. So, the night before the test, 4 of us, Mark, Jess, Eli, and I, met up outside the humanities building with flashlights and a sense of reckless determination. The building was eerily quiet, the only sounds the faint hum of the air vents and our footsteps echoing against the stone floors. Most of the classrooms were locked, but Mark insisted that the study room was hidden somewhere on the top floor, past the faculty offices. We crept up the narrow staircase, feeling the weight of the building's history pressing down on us. As we reached the top floor, we were met with a long, dimly lit hallway. At the very end was a door that looked older than any of the others, with a small brass plaque that read, "Storage." Jess gave me a nervous glance, but Mark just grinned and pushed the door open. The room was dark, filled with tall wooden shelves stacked with dusty boxes and books. The smell of old paper and musty wood filled the air. I clicked on my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the shelves. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in years, as if it was frozen in time. "This is it," Mark whispered, his eyes wide with excitement. "We just have to find his files." We split up, each of us searching a different section of the room. I ran my fingers along the dusty spines of the books, trying to make out titles, but most of them were so old the lettering had faded. After a few minutes, Jess called out, her voice echoing softly in the silence. "Over here. I think I found something." We gathered around her, peering at a stack of files labeled with years and course codes. Jess opened one of the files, revealing old exam questions and hand-scribbled notes that looked like they were written in Dr. Lanson's handwriting. It felt like we'd struck gold. But just as we started sifting through the papers, the door creaked shut behind us, and a wave of cold air swept through the room. The temperature seemed to drop, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Eli tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. He turned to us, looking pale. "Did anyone close that?" he asked, his voice shaking. We all shook our heads, glancing nervously at each other. The air in the room felt heavy, almost oppressive, and the shadows seemed to grow darker, closing in around us. "Maybe we should go," Jess whispered, clutching the stack of papers like a lifeline. But before we could move, we heard footsteps in the hallway outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps, getting louder with each passing second. Mark gestured for us to turn off our flashlights, and we stood there in the darkness holding our breath as the footsteps approached. They stopped just outside the door. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. I could feel my heart pounding, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I bit down on my lip, trying to keep from making a sound, as the door inched open. A sliver of light spilled into the room, casting long shadows across the shelves. And then we saw him, a tall, thin man standing in the doorway, his face hidden in shadow. He wore an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd expect to see in a black and white photograph, and his eyes glinted in the dim light, cold and unblinking. It was Dr. Lanson. Except it couldn't be. Dr. Lanson was in his 60s, with a full head of grey hair. But the man standing in the doorway looked younger, sharper, with dark hair slicked back and a face that was eerily expressionless. His gaze swept over the room, and I felt an icy chill as his eyes landed on us. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low and hollow, echoing through the room. Mark tried to explain, his voice shaking. We were just looking for study materials. We thought..." "This room is off limits," the man interrupted, his tone cold and final. "You shouldn't be here. Leave." Without another word, he stepped back into the hallway, and the door swung shut behind him. We stood there in stunned silence, too shocked to move. Finally, Eli snapped out of it and yanked the door open, but the hallway was empty. There was no sign of Dr. Lanson or anyone else. We didn't need any more convincing. We grabbed a handful of the files and bolted, practically tumbling down the stairs in our rush to get out of there. When we reached the ground floor, we didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for breath in the cool night air. The next morning, we took our exam in a daze, each of us haunted by what we'd seen. I could barely concentrate, my mind racing with questions. But when I looked at Dr. Lanson, sitting calmly at the front of the room, he seemed different, older, more familiar. There was no trace of the man we'd seen in the library basement. After the exam, Mark decided to confront him. He walked up to Dr. Lanson and asked if he'd been in the humanities building the night before. Dr. Lanson looked confused. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, frowning. "I was home all night, preparing for today." We left campus that day with more questions than answers, but one thing was certain. We'd encountered something, or someone, that wasn't supposed to be there, and to this day I still can't shake the feeling that we'd disturbed something in that old building, something that had been waiting in the shadows for a long, long time. When I first arrived at Thornton University, I felt like I'd stepped into a dream. The campus was an old, sprawling place, filled with ivy-covered buildings, cobblestone paths, and enormous oak trees that seemed to whisper secrets as the wind passed through their branches. It had a history, a reputation even, for its prestigious academics and renowned library. But what drew me there, besides the academics, was the sense of mystery in every corner. People said the library held secrets, and I couldn't help but want to find out. The Thornton University Library was legendary. It was a massive Gothic structure with towering spires and windows that glowed in the late afternoon light. Students joked that you could get lost in there for days and no one would even realize you were missing. Most of that was just campus lore, of course, but as a literature major with a love for old books, I was thrilled to make it my study spot. It was the perfect place to lose yourself in a book or to get absorbed in the faint smell of aging paper and leather bindings. One late October evening, I was cramming for a midterm in the library's main reading hall. The building was almost empty. Most students had left to grab dinner, and the silence was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the old grandfather clock near the entrance. Outside, a storm was gathering, and I could hear the first drops of rain pattering against the stained glass windows. Around 8 o'clock, as I was packing up to leave, I noticed a door slightly ajar near the back of the library. I'd never seen it open before. It was marked "Staff Only." Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a quick peek inside, figuring that no one would notice. The door led to a narrow staircase winding down into the basement. I had no idea the library even had a basement, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. I carefully descended the stairs, the air growing colder and damper with each step. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a dimly lit corridor lined with ancient-looking shelves filled with dusty books, journals, and boxes labeled with years and names. The smell of mildew was thick, mingling with the earthy scent of old paper. I told myself I'd just look around for a few minutes, maybe find some old university records or archived books. The basement had a strange charm, and I couldn't help but feel like I was stepping into a different era. As I moved deeper into the corridor, I noticed a faint light coming from a room at the end of the hall. I hesitated, feeling a strange unease, but then I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like someone writing on paper. I figured maybe one of the library staff was down there, cataloguing or archiving. I felt silly for being spooked and decided to say hello to let them know I was there. When I reached the room, I peered inside. It was filled with rows of filing cabinets and tables stacked with more old books and papers, and there, sitting at a desk, was a young man scribbling intently in a leather-bound notebook. He looked up as I entered, and I was struck by how out of place he seemed. His clothes were vintage, like something out of the 1930s, with a buttoned-up shirt and suspenders. "Sorry to bother you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I didn't realize anyone else was down here." He smiled faintly, his eyes oddly intense. "No bother," he replied, his voice soft but clear. "Are you looking for something in particular?" I felt myself relax a little. "I was just curious," I admitted. "I didn't know there was a basement down here." His smile widened, and he gestured to the shelves around us. "This is where the forgotten things go. The books no one reads, the stories no one tells. Thornton keeps its secrets down here." There was something about the way he said it that sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced at the book he was writing in, noticing that the pages were filled with tiny, precise handwriting. "Are you a student here?" I asked, trying to make conversation. He tilted his head, almost as if he was amused by the question. "I was a long time ago." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he just watched me, his expression unreadable. I glanced down at my watch, realizing it was getting late. "I should probably get going," I said, taking a step back. He nodded, but as I turned to leave, he spoke again. "Before you go, would you like to hear a story?" Something in his tone made me stop. I looked back, hesitating, but the curiosity was too strong to resist. "Sure," I said, feeling a strange mix of anticipation and dread. He closed the notebook and looked up at me, his eyes dark and intense. "Once, there was a student at Thornton, a curious, ambitious student who spent her days studying in the library. She loved exploring, discovering things no one else cared to find. But one night, she ventured too far into the basement, into places she wasn't meant to see." He paused, watching my reaction. My skin prickled with unease, but I forced myself to stay calm. "And what happened to her?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. His gaze softened, almost as if he felt sorry for me. "She became part of the library, part of its stories, forgotten like all the books down here." My throat felt tight, and I took another step back, my heart pounding. "Well, thanks for the story," I mumbled, feeling the urge to get out of there as quickly as possible. He nodded, his smile fading. "Be careful on your way up. The stairs can be tricky." I didn't wait to hear any more. I turned and hurried back down the corridor, my footsteps echoing in the silence. As I reached the stairs, I glanced back, half expecting to see him watching me from the doorway. But the hall was empty. I climbed the stairs as quickly as I could, my pulse racing. When I reached the main floor, I closed the door behind me and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread. I told myself it was just a strange encounter, that the guy was probably a fellow student with a flair for the dramatic. The next day, I decided to ask around about the library basement. I figured someone in the history department or one of the librarians might know more about it. When I mentioned it to one of the librarians, though, she looked at me with confusion. "There's no basement in the library," she said, frowning. The building's too old for that kind of construction. What you're describing sounds impossible." I felt a chill run down my spine as her words sank in. I tried to explain what I'd seen, the narrow staircase, the man in vintage clothes, but she just shook her head, looking at me with a mixture of concern and disbelief. After that, I tried to forget about it, tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that it was some kind of strange dream, but every so often, I find myself drawn back to the library, unable to resist the pull of curiosity. And every time, I swear I can hear it, the faint sound of a pen scratching against paper coming from somewhere deep below. I was in my second year at Dartmouth College studying history when I first heard the name Dr. Charles Linton. He was an old legend on campus, a professor who taught history for nearly 40 years before he mysteriously disappeared in the fall of 1975. The rumor was that he'd gone insane while researching some obscure medieval texts and vanished one rainy October night, never to be seen again. Every now and then, students in the history department would joke about seeing Dr. Linton in the library stacks or hearing his footsteps late at night. The whole thing became a kind of ghost story we told during late study sessions, more as a way to scare each other than out of real belief. But after what happened last semester, I'm not so sure it was all just a story. It was a rainy, miserable night in early November, the kind of night where the damp seemed to seep into your bones. I'd been in the library since noon, working on my final paper for History of Medieval Europe, and I was completely alone in the study area. Around midnight, the few other students who'd been there packed up and left, leaving me in the dim glow of the desk lamps surrounded by shelves of ancient, musty books. The library at Dartmouth is no ordinary place. Baker Berry Library is vast, with an old wing that dates back to the 1920s. It's the kind of place with high-arched windows, towering bookshelves, and endless corridors that seem to wind back on themselves. The lights cast long shadows, and in the silence, every creak of the wooden floors sounds like someone walking right behind you. I was just about to call it a night when I heard a soft sound behind me, the unmistakable rustle of pages turning. I froze, glancing around. The library was supposed to be empty. The front desk staff had left hours ago, and I hadn't seen anyone else in ages. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe the wind had knocked a loose paper off one of the shelves. But then, a few moments later, I heard it again, clearer this time. A slow, deliberate turning of pages, like someone was carefully reading in the next aisle over. A chill crept up my spine as I stood up, peering around the shelf. There, just barely visible in the shadows, was an older man with greying hair, sitting at one of the long tables. He was wearing a dark overcoat, his head bent over a large, leather-bound book. I didn't recognize him, and something about the way he was reading so intent gave me a strange feeling. "Excuse me," I said, forcing myself to speak. "Are you with the library staff?" He didn't look up, didn't even acknowledge me, just kept turning the pages with slow, careful movements. I felt a strange urge to leave, but curiosity kept me rooted in place. I cleared my throat and tried again. "Excuse me. The library closed hours ago." This time he looked up, his eyes meeting mine. They were dark, intense, and strangely cold, and his expression was one of slight annoyance, like I'd interrupted something important. "Ah, a student," he said, his voice low and calm. "Do you study history, by any chance?" I nodded, taken aback by the question. "Yes, actually, medieval history." A faint smile flickered across his face. "Excellent. Then perhaps you'd appreciate what I'm reading. A fascinating piece, though. Quite dark. Most wouldn't dare to read it." He gestured to the book on the table, a massive tome with a worn black leather cover. There were strange symbols along the spine, symbols I didn't recognize, and something about it made me uneasy. "What is it?" I asked, despite the warning bells going off in my head. He looked at me thoughtfully, as if deciding how much to tell me. It's a manuscript on heretical texts from the 14th century, a collection of writings that some would rather stay buried. It's rare. The rain was pounding against the library's high windows now, and I could hear thunder rumbling in the distance. I felt trapped in that dimly lit corner of the library, alone with this strange man who seemed to know more than he was letting on. "Have you heard of Dr. Linton?" he asked suddenly, his eyes narrowing. My heart skipped a beat. Yes, he was a professor here. Disappeared years ago. The man's lips curled into a knowing smile. Dr. Linton's research was ambitious. He delved into things that most historians would avoid. Dark things, hidden things. A crack of thunder shook the library, and for a moment, the lights flickered. I wanted to leave, to get as far away from that man as possible, but something in his gaze held me in place. "Are you sure you want to know what he found?" he asked, his voice a whisper now. "Some truths, once uncovered, cannot be forgotten." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Yes, tell me." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto mine. "Doctor, Linton discovered an ancient ritual, one that was practiced by a secret order of monks in medieval France. They believed that certain knowledge could grant them immortality, but at a cost that involved the mind and the soul. Linton found records of their texts in an old monastery, texts that detailed rituals to summon, well, let's just say, things not of this world." He glanced down at the book in front of him. "This is one of those texts. Linton, he didn't just read it. He tried to perform the ritual. Right here, in this very library." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "What happened to him?" The man's expression darkened. "He vanished. Some say he succeeded, that he called something from beyond. But he paid the price. He became part of the library itself, trapped here, bound to the knowledge he sought." A gust of wind rattled the windows, and I shivered, feeling a cold draft sweep through the aisle. The man stood up, closing the book carefully. "You should leave," he said, his tone now stern. "You've learned enough." Without another word, he turned and walked deeper into the shadows of the library, disappearing around a corner. I stood there, paralyzed, unsure whether to believe him or dismiss it as some elaborate prank. But when I finally gathered the courage to walk over to the table, the book was gone and so was he. The next day I returned to the library, searching for any sign of the man or the book he'd been reading. I asked the librarian, describing the man I'd met, hoping he might have been a visiting professor or some eccentric staff member. She looked at me with confusion. "There was no one here last night," she said. "I was the last to leave, and I locked up myself. And the section you're describing, we closed it off years ago. That part of the library is unsafe due to structural issues." She gave me a strange look as I tried to process what she was saying. I'd seen it. I'd been there. But when I went to the section again, the door was locked, and there was no sign of the table or the book. To this day, I don't know who or what I encountered that night. But sometimes, when I'm studying late in the library, I hear faint footsteps echoing down the aisles, or catch the soft rustle of pages turning just beyond the edge of the light. And every now and then, in the shadows between the shelves, I think I see a glimpse of a tall man, watching, waiting, as if he's still guarding his secrets, hoping to find someone willing to uncover the truth, no matter the cost.